My name is Dave Armstrong. I'm the president of Thomas More College, and I just want to welcome everyone to beautiful Thomas More today. As you know, when you come to Thomas More, every day is 75 and sunny. If you didn't know, Bill Madonna College, our first iteration, was founded in 1921 to teach teachers. It was founded as an education school, as an education college. And so we take great pride in our education department and the fact that we've continued that tradition for almost 100 years. And to have educators on our campus to talk about such an important issue is very special to us. So I want to thank the Northern Kentucky Education Council, Polly Gage, and all those that are here, and our featured speaker for coming to Thomas More today. And God bless you. I hope you have a great session today. Thanks.
Thank you. Just in case I get thirsty. Frisch's apparently doesn't have small sizes, huh? All right, so let's see. Hardest thing for me to do is talk and not move, but the mic is here, so I will certainly do the best I can, but my voice does carry fairly well. So really what we're going to talk about is, as you know, and what a wonderful organization this is, to be a community organization, to partner with the schools as well as partnering with the communities to help these children get out of poverty. And that's really what we're going to talk about. This was just published in the Washington Post by Elaine Weiss a couple years ago, that the real 21st century problem in public education is poverty. And I brought this in because I don't think most school districts or even regions of the country are as advanced as you are in understanding this and are as far along as you are in understanding this. And we have an explosive growth in student poverty. It's not as though student poverty is stabilized or we've really managed it. We actually, in 2000, 1/2 of the student body in 4 states was eligible for free and reduced meals. Just 11 years later, over half of public school students are poor in 17 states. And all but 2 southern states and most western states are 50% children below the poverty line. That is amazing. So it is huge. Student poverty is a dominant reality. And in 3 of the biggest states, California, Texas, and Florida, it is nearly the majority of the students, and also that's true of New York, Michigan, and Illinois, where I am from. So what I'm going to be going through today is that children raised in poverty are exposed to a different kind of environment in terms of lots of things, but one of the major areas is language. We know from research that's been out there since 1995, and I'll share it with you, that when a child is raised in a home where someone is impoverished, and we know this from Hart and Risley's research, there just isn't as much talking in the home. We also have a lot of different cultures. Some of this is cultural. I was speaking at a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia on Saturday, and a woman raised her hand and said, "Did you realize that a lot of times in Asian families, they're much quieter families, they don't talk as much." So we have cultural differences from homes to home, but when young children aren't exposed to language, language is one of the drivers of what we call the brain setup period. Language is what gets the brain architecture to start maturing. So the more language a child can hear, and if there's any takeaway from this today, the more as community activists you can help parents understand the importance of talking to their children. If they can read, that's wonderful. If they can read to their children, but if they can't read, I'm just as happy if they talk to their children. And if parents are working 2 jobs or 3 jobs and no one's at home to talk to the children, if we can have community resources, libraries, or places where children can go and be read to when they're young, that would just be marvelous, because that is really an essential part of building the architecture of the brain that's going to be essential for learning once a child enters school. Secondly, we know that income negatively impacts cognitive functions. And by cognitive functions, I'm not talking about academic skills. I'm not talking about reading or mathematics. I'm talking about underlying capacities that make learning easier, like being able to pay attention in a classroom, being able to sustain attention to a teacher and ignore distractions, being able to do what we call working memory, hold the information in mind while the teacher's talking at the beginning of the class until the end of the class. And that working memory is the brain's RAM. If you know RAM from a computer, second you shut down your computer, you lose everything you haven't saved. Same thing happens with working memory. So working memory is an ongoing memory that we use to get through a lecture like this, for example, so that you can remember at the end what I've said at the beginning. And then what is essential to you will be saved, and what isn't essential to you will disappear when you go to sleep at night. So those underlying capacities are affected, cognitive capacities, by poverty. And I should add, before I go to the next one, that it has nothing to do with intelligence. We're not talking about, we can have exactly the same IQ of children, or exactly the same, what psychologists now refer to more as general intelligence capacity, and yet have differences in attentional skills. And probably all of you know someone who is very bright but has poor attentional skills. And individuals who have poor problems with attention have trouble in school. So it isn't necessarily, these cognitive capacities are not linked to intelligence. They're separate. So poverty is also associated with chronic stress, and stress affects the way the brain develops. So there's a wonderful book by Eric Jensen called Teaching with Poverty in Mind, and one of the big points he makes is that when children come from homes of poverty, those homes also have added stress. Now, we can have stress all over in any income bracket. Anyone can have a stressful period in their lives. Some families have more stress than others. They have the death of a parent would be very stressful. The parent goes through a very contentious divorce that can be stressful. Other kinds of stressors exist in families. So stress on its own can impact the way a brain matures and the way a brain responds to school. Add poverty to that and you really have a double whammy. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about English language learners. I know that in Kentucky you do have a lot of students who are learning English as their second language. I'm sure probably many of them, are, as they are in the Chicago area, are Hispanic, Latino families where Spanish is their first language, but you probably also have Asian families. We certainly do a lot of Korean, a lot of Hmong, a lot of Chinese and Japanese families, and then we have a lot of Arabic families where Arabic is the native language now that are coming to our metropolitan areas. And those children have a triple jeopardy because very often, especially if they're undocumented, if the parents are undocumented, there's the stress of deportation, there's the stress that comes with poverty, and many of these individuals have a lot of poverty in their home, in their environment. They're often working 2 and 3 jobs. They're sometimes sending money back home to their family in whatever their native country is. And so they have the stress of trying to make ends meet, the stress of the fear of being picked up or being deported, and then in addition to that, just poverty itself. So what I spoke about this morning, and I won't spend too much time on it, is that there are now computerized interventions that are designed to build up cognitive capacities, and they look like computer games. So students look at them and they seem like they might be a computer game. Although of the students here in Boone County who have used them pretty quickly after about a week or so stop thinking they're games anymore because they're pretty difficult and challenging, and the students realize this isn't like playing Candy Crush. But they are designed to build these underlying capacities, essentially so teachers can teach. So let's just start with all of this information. So you will now have it all yourself as factual information that you can use when you're advocating for your families in the community and helping the school district as well, especially with fundraising or other ways that we can improve the amount of income that the schools have and to use to help these children. So the first thing I'll start with is what I referred to earlier, this research by Hart and Risley that was published in 1995. The name of their book was Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children. And what you may or may not know is the research was in the 90s, so they were using tape recorders. For some of you, you don't even know what a tape recorder is if you're fairly young, but they actually placed tape recorders in homes, and they recorded how many words were spoken in the home. They also recorded whether the language was directed at a child, and if so, what the parents were talking about. But in this particular graph, this is just a measure of how many words were spoken, how much talking was going on in the home in general. Were they talking to each other, the husband and wife? Were they talking to friends on the phone? And it just recorded them. And what's interesting about this is children who came from your homes where there's a professional in the home, a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer, were exposed to 45 million words by the time they were 4 years of age. And if you think about that, that is 10 million words a year, over 10 million words, closer to 11 or 12 million words a year. Now, the brain, you'll learn, is experience dependent. The way the brain builds itself in this early setup period of birth to 5 years of age, before a child goes to school, is based on experiences. So a child who comes from a home where people are talking a lot and conversing with each other is hearing millions of words, 42 million words. Child, though, who comes from a home, Hart and Risley found below the poverty line, is exposed to 32 million fewer words. 32 million word gap. Their total number of words is 13 million. Meaning in that 4-year period of time, they're hearing about 1/10 the number of words that a child is from a professional home. Instead of 10 million a year, they're hearing just about 1 million a year. That's huge, because that's 42 million fewer opportunities for the brain to build itself for language skills. And we know that when children start off kindergarten and first grade at 5 and 6 years of age with language skills that are significantly below their peers, the gap actually widens as they go through school. And you would think, well, why would that happen? Because they're getting all this language exposure in school. The problem is, if you enter school with a 32 million word gap, then you have problems listening to a teacher and following what the teacher is saying in the classroom. You don't have enough vocabulary, you haven't had enough experience with language, so much of what the teacher's saying is going over these students' heads. We also know that when children enter school with poor language skills or reduced language skills, it's harder for them to learn to read. I'll show you that research. Reading is much more difficult because reading is superimposed on the language parts of the brain. And so what happens is they're not reading and they're not learning from reading. They're not learning new vocabulary. They're not learning new concepts. So this gap gets wider. And the gap is getting wider not because the teachers aren't teaching, not because they aren't competent, but because the students started behind and that left such a big gap in their ability to learn. Now, here's the research on cognitive skills. And what I want you to understand about this is that these are not skills that a teacher teaches. So none of these skills are part of curriculum per se. Now, we get better at some of these things when we go through school, and they're exercised. These skills are exercised. But I want you to step back just a minute and just think to yourself, and maybe somebody could even raise their hand and answer, what if I wanted to be a musician? If I wanted to be a professional violinist, what underlying capacities would I have to have? Well, I'd have to be able to carry a tune. You can't play a violin if you can't carry a tune. I'd have to be able to, I'd have to enjoy music. I would have to be able to read music and figure out what notes are. So those are capacities I would have to have. If I wanted to be an athlete, my husband was a pro basketball player, and he'll look at young boys and he'll say, he's going to be a really great athlete, I can just tell. And I'll say, my husband played basketball for the Bulls, but a long time ago. You wouldn't know him. But anyway, they were the baby Bulls. But he'll look at a kid and I'll say, well, how do you know he's going to be a good athlete? He says, look at how fast he is. Look at how quick he is. Look at how quick his movements are and how quickly he responds to changes around him. And I can tell by his agility. He's flexible. He's agile. When he's running, it looks like he's relaxed. He doesn't look tense. And he said, and look at his ball handling skills. Okay, and just as an aside, my husband very unfortunately married a klutz who has no athlete in our family anywhere ever. Ever. There was never a dancer nor an athlete, and the kids got my genes. I just thought I would tell you that, which was very unfortunate. But I want you to think of underlying capacity, okay? Well, learning has underlying capacities. And it isn't how smart you are. It is, number one, how well can you pay attention to on demand? How well can you sit in a classroom and ignore what's going on in the playground and ignore that cute little girl sitting next to you and ignore the boy who's making spitballs and concentrate on a teacher? Now, we don't ask teachers to teach attention, but we can exercise attentional skills. Did you know that? With computer programs. You can exercise attentional skills. It's called cognitive control. You think of cognitive control as self-control. Does the child have self-control? Can they learn on demand? Can they pay attention? Can they keep paying attention? Can they resist impulses to get up and move around, or resist impulses to walk around the room or to leave the room? And that cognitive control is an underlying capacity that is affected in children of poverty. It isn't as well developed. Children of poverty also have problems with what we call working memory, this capacity to hold information in mind for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour, so that when you're reading a book, you can remember what you read in the first few pages. When you're listening to a teacher, you can remember at the end of the class what the teacher was talking about at the beginning. All right? These are really important for school, because if you're not attending, you're not learning. And if you can't remember what the teacher said, then when you go home at night, you have to start all over with your homework from level 1 and try to figure it out. And if you don't have parents who are home who can help you, you're stymied, and then you go back to school the next day and you haven't done it. Not because you didn't want to, not because you weren't motivated, but because you couldn't remember what it was you were supposed to do. Or you forgot your homework assignments even. All right? We've talked about language as an underlying capacity. We also have other underlying capacities, like your ability to make sense out of space. It's called spatial cognition. That in children of poverty, we've known, because of research by Kimberly Nobles, as long as 10 years ago, we've known that these underlying capacities, these cognitive capacities, are less developed in children of poverty than children who come from homes where they're above the poverty line. But the research that really knocked us all off our feet came out this year, just a few months ago, It was Kimberly Nobles again. It was published in the journal Nature Neuroscience. You can see just less than 6 months ago. And what she did is she looked at children from all stratas of society. So she looked at very wealthy children. She included in her study children whose parents are multimillionaires and billionaires. She included children who we would consider come from wealthy families where the father makes maybe $200,000 a year or something. She looked at kind of more standard middle-class families where the parents made $80,000, $70,000, and then she looked at children in families where the income was less than $20,000 a year and less than $10,000 a year. And what she found was, oh, and I should add that what she was looking at now wasn't cognitive skills, but was actually the thickness of the surface of the brain. Now, I want to explain what that means. The surface of your brain has all the neurons in it, and it also has the connections that those neurons make when you learn new things. So the thicker the surface of your brain is, the more information, the more knowledge you have. Does that make sense? The more content, really, you have, in a way. And every time you learn something new, a neuron makes new connections with these little fingers. And those little fingers and the cell bodies themselves make up this surface of the brain. It's kind of like the rind of an orange, all right? And the reason, by the way, that humans have this brain with all these wrinkles in it is the more wrinkles you have, the more surface area you have, which every woman in this room over 50 knows that as your skin has more surface area to it, you get wrinkles, okay? So that's what happens. It loses its elasticity, you get more wrinkles. But in the brain, wrinkles are really good things. And I'm hoping someday there'll be really good things on our skin too. Someone will think, but that's something else. All right, so what she found then is she's measuring the thickness of this cortex, and she found that if you come from a family where the income is in the billions, there's no difference in your brain, or very little difference in your brain between that income level and making $50,000 a year. Isn't that amazing? That in upper income brackets, it doesn't matter much in terms of brain development. But among children from the lower income families, once you get below the poverty line, small differences in income have huge differences in the thickness of the cortex, the thickness of the human brain, that tells you how many experiences they had. It's really qualitative. How many enriching experiences did this child have? That's really what you're asking. And children below the poverty line, the further you go down, small increments mean they've had less novel experiences, less experiences to build the cortex, the part of the brain that learns. So that there's a big difference between a family where the annual income is $15,000 a year and where the annual income is $10,000 a year. And even a bigger difference between the children where the annual income is $10,000 and where it might be $5,000. So small differences in income result in huge differences in the thickness of the brain. Thickness of the brain equate to how many new experiences the person's had for learning. All right? This is actually the data that she got. It's a scan. You could all have it done if you want. You could have this kind of scan done. You just go probably to University of Cincinnati because they have a great brain scanning laboratory. And really what I want you to see is where the thickness was different. Where we see the thickness different in the children who have come from poverty is in regions of the left side of the brain, right here, that are very important for thinking, for problem solving, for reading, and for language. Now, what's interesting, though, is the thickness of other parts of the brain, like the parts of the brain that are very important for sports or athletics, motor skills, sensory motor kinds of in skills is actually the same or better in some children of poverty. The problem is it's the parts of the brain that they need to do well in school that haven't been equipped for learning. So when she summarizes her brain structure, that she saw differences now in this new paper this way. The area of the brain that supports language is less thick. And by the way, if any of you had this done, you would find there's a little area of the brain that's important for language and symbol skills that will be thicker in you than people who have had less education than you have. There is a measure that you can take that actually would predict how many years of formal education you've had in the thickness of one part of your brain. So, but what she found is these children of poverty, where the differences were greatest, the areas that support language, the areas that support reading, the areas that support executive functions, those are frontal lobe functions of being organized and being able to pay attention on demand and being able to be goal-oriented, and spatial skills. Spatial skills are very important for mathematics, for geometry, for certain kinds of sciences, okay, the physical sciences especially. All right, and I put this homeless child's picture on because it is so poignant, and I know I was speaking to someone in the last session we did about the homeless population, and she said that's what she does. She's the liaison for homeless families. But once you get that low, homeless families are the poorest of the poor. And they are going to have the most dramatic differences neurologically. And think about their experiences even in school. They're moving from school to school to school depending upon where their parents are living this week or next week. And think about the stress in their environment of not only not knowing if you're going to eat tonight, but are you actually going to have a safe place just to sleep, where you wouldn't be hurt, where you wouldn't be physically abused, or where you wouldn't freeze to death as we get into the colder temperatures. So what Nobles summarized in her conclusion is the research implies that income relates most strongly to brain structure among the most disadvantaged students. 2 months ago, July 20th, Polak et al. Just published an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, so the Pediatrics Journal, so this was for physicians. The effect of poverty on brains may explain poor kids' lower test scores. 20% of the gap in test scores between poor children and middle-class children may be a result of poor brain development in the frontal lobe and in the temporal lobes. So they're even starting to figure out what are the parts of the brain that when they develop well, you have high levels of test performance on standardized tests. Now think about this for teachers, for our teachers who change brains. They have the most important job I think there is in society. If anything is going to be a path out of poverty, it's going to be education. Because for several reasons, we talked about it this morning. One is the education, the classroom provides 6 hours a day of a non-stressful environment. If the student comes into this classroom and the teacher is fostering and caring for that student, that's a safe haven. 6 hours a day, 30 hours a week. That 30 hours a week can do a lot to change the brain of a child whose brain is entering school at a disadvantage. Because teachers build brains, and they change brains. The brain of someone who's been educated is a very different brain from the brain of someone who's never gone through formal education. So the path out of poverty is to build these structures, and the structures that educators build are the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes. The big problem we have is if the students come to school too far behind. A teacher has 30 students. in front of them, 35 students. And they are going to have students at all different levels for learning. And when they have a child who isn't ready to learn, that really poses a challenge for that teacher, because that student is not going to be able to sit and listen to the teacher. They're not attending to the teacher. They're not holding on to what the teacher says. That frustrates the student. It frustrates the teacher. The good news is neuroscience has ways to build these parts of the brain very specifically with exercises that the students can do outside of the classroom. All right, let's look at the research on stress in a little bit more detail. And I just have to keep an eye on my time here. Excessive stress disrupts the architecture of the developing brain. This was a working paper published at Harvard University on their National Scientific Council just last year. And I just thought I'd bring this. It's also entering our schools' understanding as well. This just came out it was the September-October edition of the Texas School Bulletin that you can get online if you're interested. But that issue, the whole issue, was neuroscience in the classroom, but specifically stress and the brain. And what that particular article is geared toward is it's geared to educators. It says educators apply the latest neuroscience to foster healthy development in students dealing with poverty-related stress. So let's talk about stress as though you don't know what stress is. We all know what stress is, okay? So we all have stress that comes to us intermittently. We can't control it. Intermittent stress, our body is really pretty good at handling. So any kind of stressful event, the death of a loved one, an accident in the home, a parental separation, being discriminated against or feeling that you've being discriminated against for your race or your ethnicity or other serious events cause stress, okay? And we have a stress response in the brain that helps us deal with stress. So stress is actually not necessarily a bad thing. As long as you feel you can control it and as long as it goes away, then you actually build up resilience. But the problem is and that's tolerable stress. So tolerable stress is stress where we feel we have a little bit of control, we know it's not going to last forever, and we develop coping strategies for it, and it is fine as long as it's limited. But if it keeps going, if the stress continues, and we either feel we can't control it or we feel that it's overwhelming us, then that negatively affects the way the brain develops. Limited stress allows the brain to recover and reverse harmful effects and actually builds resilience. But it's always, and I should emphasize this because it's why this council is so important, it's in the context of ongoing supportive relationships with adults. So when children have stressful homes, the research shows if there's one adult, and you could actually get the study, it's this study that I'm pointing to that's talked about here and also here. Both of these actually discuss the research. Sorry, I have to go through all this animation. But what the research is showing is as long as a child has at least one adult in the environment that they trust, that they feel is protective of them, and they feel supports them, they can survive the stress and actually will develop resilience. Now, for many of our students of poverty, that will be a teacher. That will be a special teacher, or it might be a coach. So I've had lots of students, you probably have too, where athletics was where they shine, and they have a coach that inspired them. And that was actually true of my husband. My husband grew up in a rural poverty home. His mother made less than $5,000 a year. He had no father in the home in southern Illinois, rural southern Illinois. But he had a priest and a coach who took care of him and his twin brother and supported them. The mother was under way too much stress to be able to do much to help the family, but these two people were the people that guided my husband through, and he ended up getting a basketball scholarship at Northwestern, and that's where we met. But that's what it takes. It takes some kind of a supportive adult. It can be in the community, it can be in the school. The school is a wonderful place for that. Now, here's the other kind of stress, toxic stress. Toxic stress is strong, frequent, prolonged activation of the body's stress system where it's never relenting. Toxic stress can be, it's chronic and it's uncontrollable. So it's something the person has no control over themselves. It can be in a home where there's a lot of abuse, for example, and the abuse is unpredictable, but it's constant and it's chronic. Or it can be in an environment where the children just don't have any adults supporting them in any way, shape, or form. So examples I give are chronic abuse, especially during the early sensitive periods. The effects of stress on the brain are essentially they short out the cortex. They short out the parts of the brain that think and reason, because the brain is all about survival. When you have toxic stress, you are in survival mode. And so the brain, because it's plastic and because it's experience dependent, is going to develop to tolerate the stress. Does that make sense? The brain is going to develop or mature to be able to survive, not to be able to do the luxury of learning or reading or math. That's something you get to do when you're not trying to survive. And I'm going to show you what the stress system actually looks like. But the regions of the brain that are going to become overdeveloped with a child who's in a very stressful environment are the regions of the brain involved in fear, anxiety, impulsive responses. That's where you're going to get more connections. Those are the parts of the brain that are going to get bigger and stronger. The regions dedicated to reasoning, planning, and behavioral control are going to suffer as a result. They're not going to develop. Extreme exposure to stress changes the stress response system too, which I'm going to explain in just a minute. Whereas you and I can look at a stressful situation and be relatively thoughtful about it. Let's say, and I'm just going to give you an example that's been in the news so much over the last few months. Let's say that I'm speeding and a police car pulls up behind me and pulls me over. All right, and it actually just happened to me a few months ago when I was in Florida, and a police car pulled me over very unfairly. I was not speeding, but I was in the, yeah, you're all going, yeah, we know. I was in the far left lane, and he didn't want me in the far left lane. He wanted me to move over, and I didn't. I just stayed in the far left lane because there was a lot of traffic, and it was going more smoothly. So anyway, he pulls me over. Now, what did I do? Okay, I know better than to say, you idiot, I wasn't speeding, or what. I said, officer, what did I do wrong? And I used the word officer, and he said, you were in the left lane. Let me explain Florida. In Florida, you don't get in the left lane and stay there if you only move in the left lane to pass. I said, I'm so sorry, officer, I didn't realize that. And he then said, okay, I'm going to let you off this time, just don't do it in the future. Now, if I had been chronically under stress, and my stress reactor was strong, but my cognitive skills weren't, and he pulled me over, what would I do? I might call him a name. I might say, this is absurd, you're harassing me, what are you doing, pulling me over, I wasn't speeding, I wasn't doing anything wrong, give me your badge number, and I thought of all those things, by the way. But I controlled it, and I controlled it because I have a stress system that I can maintain control. When the stress system has been overactivated for years, it responds faster and immediately. You don't think, you act first. It's the flight or fight response. So I probably wouldn't be very good if I were attacked by a bear, because I might be thinking, oh, this could be a friendly bear. Perhaps this is a bear from the zoo, and if I'm just quiet, I'll be all right. And I would be dead. All right? So, but because I was never raised to be worried about bears, so the point is that if you've been in stress, you have this trigger happy stress system that all it takes is a tap on the shoulder or just the slightest bit of a threat, and you explode. And you might explode verbally, you might explode physically, or exploding would be fight, you might flee, you might run away. Okay? And keep in mind, and I mentioned this morning, think of the policeman's job. Policeman's under stress all day, every day, too. And the policeman, after a while, is going to have that same hyperactive stress response, too. So that if somebody threatens them, what are they going to do? They're going to shoot before they think. That's what happens when the stress response is overactivated. It responds at lower thresholds. It activates more frequently for longer periods. These are people we describe as having anger management problems, or people we say are impulsive and have poor self-control, and we tend to think of it as their problem. It actually was their brain developing a coping mechanism to chronic stress, okay? Which 200 years ago might have helped them. It's not helping them today. This is the stress response system. It's very deep in the brain. It's very low level. It's very primitive. Animals have the same stress response system, and it includes the part of the brain that produces adrenaline, which gets you all hyped up, and the part of the brain that produces cortisol, which is your stress hormone. When cortisol is released, your immune system goes down, and all cognitive processes decrease. Thinking, reasoning, planning. So when this gets activated, you can't be reasonable. And we've all been there, and we've all been enraged enough at one time in our life, or frightened enough that we felt this short out the brain, and that's literally what's happening here. So both adrenaline and cortisol are produced under normal circumstances to help you to cope with stressors, but if you have chronic stress, they're in your system all the time. All right? That can lead to impairments in learning, memory, and the ability to regulate your stress response in general. And when children experience this toxic stress, their cortisol levels remain elevated for very long periods of time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. It's also why we see professional athletes who have come from impoverished homes who are very successful in athletics, but are still very easily triggered and very easily angered and get themselves in a lot of trouble sometimes with the law, because we gave them success, but we didn't give them the brain to cope with stress. Does that make sense? All right. Both animal and human studies show that long-term elevations in cortisol alter the function of the brain, essentially, and they lower the immune response. The big takeaway, though, is it changes the architecture of regions of the brain that you use for learning and for memory. School becomes very, very hard. Okay, and this was an article just in Edutopia last week. In any of you who get Edutopia, you can go in and get it just online. It's just an online journal for teachers. And it's the neuroscience of bullying. What bullying does to the human brain. And one of the things they talk about is the importance of, again, a teacher who is caring and supportive in a classroom, as opposed to a teacher that might make a child feel inferior, or a teacher that might add to the stress that they have. A few other things for those of you, because I know this is a community organization. Maternal stress affects pregnancy, and it also affects the maternal care later on. So when a mother is under a lot of stress when she's pregnant, her children have less parenting skills when they're adults. It's fascinating. They're less fostering, they're less caring. It's as though nature is saying, you're preparing you for this horribly stressful world. And taking care of children isn't as important as staying alive. It affects the development of the stress system. It also alters genes that are involved in brain development. Okay, now we also know that when children enter school, because of all of these factors, their readiness for kindergarten is decreased. And we can look at what the factors are that are going to impact a child's readiness for kindergarten. Over and above poverty, having a single parent is a factor, as opposed to coming from a two-parent home. Having a mother who didn't graduate high school is a factor. Living below the poverty line and living in a household where English was not spoken as the first language. If we look at these risk factors, 4 being the most risk factors you have, and we just look at academic skills of students in reading and math after 3 years of school, you see the more risk factors the child has, the poorer their scores at the end of 3rd grade. So we have all of these, I call them cascading factors. Factors where one factor impacts the next factor impacts the next. And it's very hard to decluster those. We also see that same kind of relationship with working memory, the ability to hold information in mind for learning. Now, I just took this for you. I am from Cincinnati, so I'm very familiar. I grew up in this area, and actually my father was a minister in a church in Covington, Kentucky, so every Sunday we came down when he preached at his church. This was something that Randy Poe sent me, actually, from the Cincinnati Enquirer last week, so I thought it was fairly timely. And the title of the column was Conway, Stay Away from Kentucky's Children. Apparently he's running for governor. All right, and he wants to expand public preschool education to 3- and 4-year-olds. Naughty man. And after 50 years, says this Tom Wirtz, after 50 years, taxpayers have invested $200 billion on the failed Head Start program. That's a conclusion of 4 reports produced by the federal government's Health and Human Services and General Accountability Office. So I thought I would do a little research on this for you. And so I did. So here's the reality check. Some states, yes, and this government report was based on some studies done in Tennessee where they showed gains in math, language, and reading from pre-K. You first have these big gains in kindergarten, but then by the 3rd grade, the gains aren't there anymore. But there are other school districts where the gains have been dramatic and have been enduring, which apparently this columnist didn't look at. Boston School District, for example, Boston schools showed that children enrolled in pre-K gained 4 to 7 months progress in reading and math, and those gains persisted for 3 years. So they gained almost a half a year on average in math and reading scores. 27% more of Boston's preschool children scored proficient or better on 3rd grade exams than those who weren't in preschool. So New Jersey schools, poor children who went to pre-K and are now in the 5th grade, closed 20 to 30% of the achievement gap that distinguished poor children from the national average. So in other words, we have school districts that are having very successful pre-K programs. So what's the difference between those school districts and Tennessee, for example? Lasting achievement has also been reported in North Carolina, Michigan, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Chicago. Economists estimate that children who attended Chicago's child parent centers had a 29% higher high school graduation rate. So this is going all the way through to graduation, and 42% lower arrest rate. So what we're seeing is pre-K is helping this stressed brain, obviously. We're not seeing so many of the behavioral emotional issues. Economists calculate that every dollar invested in those centers generated $7 or more in benefits. Benefits that help the community save money because you're spending less on jails and incarceration, and you're having more productive high school graduates in the economic system. The difference, the pre-K programs that were effective, and I'm just going to say it from what I remember, trained their teachers on child development and gave them professional development on what it is you teach preschool children to do. In Tennessee, it turned out none of the teachers were trained for pre-K. They were just sent into the pre-K and essentially told to do what they felt like doing. There wasn't any training involved, okay? It also depends on what you pay for pre-K. Boston spends $10,000 for each preschooler. The national average is $4,000. That is a third of what we spend on K-12 students. K-12 students per year are 3 times that, over 12,000. So we can't expect pre-K to be helpful to us if we're not educating the teachers and we're not willing to invest a little bit in the children, which is why all of you are so important, because you are helping the schools get the funds that they need. Just a few other things to finish up today, and then I'll take questions. English language learning is foreign languages, having more than one language, I'll put it that way. Being bilingual is very good for the human brain, all right? So I'm going to show you the bilingual brain here. We haven't seen too many brain scans. What you're looking at is we've taken a slice through the brain here with, of course, imaging technology, okay? And all of you could have this done too. You could have this particular picture of your brain done. This is the front of your brain right there. This is the back of your brain. And right here is your language area. Speaking, where you speak, where you talk. If you are taught, and I should add that this research was done at Columbia University in New York, and the woman who did it, Joy Hirsch, actually went to the United Nations and actually did these scans on translators and interpreters for the UN. So these are all bilingual adults that she was looking at. The bilingual adults on the left, the bilingual adult here, spoke 2 languages. She was a French interpreter, and she learned French as a second language after she entered school. And what you can see is the red square is her ability to speak English, the English map in her brain, and the yellow area is the French map in her brain. Can you learn a second language after you enter school? Of course you can. And your brain will carve out a space for that language. And both are the same size, pretty much, but there are no overlapping neurons. They're either English-speaking neurons or French neurons. So this person will always have an accent and always have to translate a little to go into French. This is a bilingual who learned their second language. In this case, the second language was English, the first language was Turkish, before they entered school, during the critical period, all right, as an infant or a young child. Many of your English language learners have that opportunity if you have pre-K. So if you have pre-K programs or you have community programs, resources where the children can go to a library and be read to in English, so they're being exposed to the English language in addition to their native language, their brain would look like this. And I want you to notice a few things. A, the area in all is much bigger. It's almost twice as big. More of the brain is devoted to language in a bilingual brain than in a unilingual or monolingual brain. Okay? It's as though you've said to the brain, languages are important. Devote a lot of your territory to languages. Okay? Second, notice that most of the cells overlap. This person is speaking Tinglish. They have Turkish phonemes and English speech sounds. They have Turkish words and English words, and they're all one big language. And this person will never have to translate, and they'll never have an accent in either language. They can go back and forth in each language, they can think in each language, they can read in each language, they can learn in each language. If you expose your English language learners to English, either through pre-K or through community-centered activities, not television, by the way. Television doesn't teach language. There's quite a bit of research, and if you want that research, I'll share it with you. Patricia Kuhl did it, where she tried to teach Mandarin Chinese to children who were 3-year-olds with a TV versus a real Mandarin speaker. And the children who watched the Mandarin speaker on TV learned no Mandarin. The children who actually sat with the Mandarin speaker learned Mandarin. So the children need interaction with a human being. It can be in a pre-K school environment, it can be in a community environment, but if we expose them to English when they're young, we're not only equipping them for school later, where they're going to learn in English, we're making their brains better at language in general. We're creating smarter kids, okay? Just by something as little as exposing non-language